So I thought I would start with that. And there's a whole host of various organizations and so on that do fund me. Of course, Alberta Wheat, a big funder, Western Grains, Ducks Unlimited, and the Western Wheat Initiative. I've got some funding through Aphid, Alberta Innovates, Biosolutions, and the Saskatchewan Alberta Wheat Commissions as well. And all of those funds are directed towards breeding better varieties for across Western Canada, not necessarily the same variety across Western Canada, but improved varieties to meet the needs of farmers in the various areas that winter wheat is grown. So if we move on, in terms of the objectives for the program, wheat breeding, whether it's spring wheat or winter wheat or any crop in general, is on about that 10-year cycle from the time you make a cross to registration. With winter cereals or winter crops, of course, we can't use winter nurseries. And so it's essentially one generation a year, and we can't speed it up all that much. This triangle basically represents, we start with very large populations, and through time we shape populations and we test and get rid of those lines that don't meet our objectives. What are our objectives? Well, you can divide them up in three main areas: agronomics, disease and pest resistance, and end-use processing quality. From an agronomic standpoint, nothing magical here. We want higher yield than the best available cultivar. That's my goal. We want excellent cold tolerance, a range in maturity. With winter wheat, maturity is generally not an issue, but there are a lot of producers that want to have winter wheat off prior to spring crops and so on, so they're not butting up against barley or peas and so on. And so depending where you are on the prairies, some varieties, for instance, down here in southern Alberta, we can go much later maturity. And in fact, they tend to work a little bit better because they use every last little bit of moisture that they get later on in the season. You go up north of here, say into the Lacombe area, something like Radiant or one of our newer varieties, Wildfire, which is even a little later than Radiant, probably won't be popular because for that area, you'll be starting to get close to that spring wheat maturity. And so while the yield is higher, they want early maturity, and a variety that's been popular there first was CDC Falcon and now is Flourish. Flourish being the earliest maturing winter wheat that's available right now. We want medium to short straw, again, depending on the application. In general, taller varieties tend to have a little bit better drought tolerance. Shorter varieties, of course, allow farmers to put the winter wheat on irrigation, something that 20 years ago probably would have never been thought about. And we're seeing a lot of irrigated winter wheat now with varieties like Radiant and more recently with Gateway. Of course, good lodging resistance, high test weight, and medium to large seed size. The idea behind the larger seed size is not to sell more seed. The idea is that with a larger seed, you've actually got more reserves in that kernel to hopefully produce a more vigorous plant. One of the areas that we're really concentrating on is disease and pest resistance. And when I came here 18 years ago, the program for the most part really dealt with developing varieties for Alberta, and it became pretty apparent fairly quickly that we really needed to expand that mandate to developing varieties for all of Western Canada. And a lot of that came down to what types of disease resistance we were incorporating into our germplasm. For Alberta, I would say that the main disease resistance characteristics that we're looking for are good stripe rust resistance, fusarium resistance, because it is becoming more and more of a problem. We want wheat curl mite resistance to combat wheat streak mosaic. And finally, we are also working on bunt resistance, although as farmers use more and more seed treatments that Brian was talking about, it does tend to control bunt. And so that's somewhat of a lesser objective. A new objective that we're working on and have been for about the past 15 years, and we're starting to get some nice material, is we're also developing solid stem winter wheat. For any of you that know what's going on in Montana, and Brian alluded to it, wheat stem sawfly has become a major issue for winter wheat in Montana. There's a new biotype down there that emerged about 20 years ago, maybe a little longer, and its life cycle is synchronized to that of winter wheat. It's not here yet, thankfully, but what we have seen in the past 5 years is it's spread from Montana down through Wyoming and across to Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, and I think even into Oklahoma. So the breeders there are scrambling because they didn't see it coming. I don't want to be in that situation. So it's a little bit of speculative breeding on my part, but if once the problem does emerge, we hope to be absolutely ready with a variety or varieties that will be able to combat that pest. We've always worked on Russian wheat aphid resistance. By always, I mean that initiative started in the late 80s, and we are starting to get some resistance to the Russian wheat aphid now. Wildfire being the first variety with some Russian wheat aphid resistance. And through some work with Haley Catton and so on, there has been some cereal leaf beetle resistance that's been identified, and we have incorporated that into some of our populations, but it's really early days.
When you say resistance, are you talking about them not liking a taste, or what are you talking about? The viruses they carry, or what are you resistant to?
Well, the question was, what's the mechanism of resistance? In some cases, we don't know. We know why it's resistant, but we don't know from a genetic standpoint. As an example, with wheat curl mite resistance, the way that resistance works is when the mite feeds on the leaves, it creates a response in the plant for the leaf to curl from a lengthwise direction. So essentially, the leaf creates an onion tube type of structure. And so the mites are protected. And that creates a really nice environment for them to reproduce. And you can get an epidemic going. What happens in the resistant lines is the leaves don't curl. And that's why we call it wheat curl mite resistance. That's basically the same case with Russian wheat aphid resistance to some extent. In the case of cereal leaf beetle, it's actually hairy leaves. So we're incorporating some of these traits into some populations to see if we need them. In the case of wheat stem sawfly, of course, it's solid stem. So that's how that works. From the standpoint of end-use processing quality, my program, I would say roughly is 80% Canada Western Red Winter type. As a subset of that, we're also working on much improved quality for the red winters, with the ultimate objective being that we would create winter wheat with CWRS quality. When I started on this project, some people said I was crazy. I now know I'm definitely not crazy. We have some lines that are within a hair of that. Will they ever be seen by farmers? Not sure yet. We've got the quality. I'm not sure we have the disease resistance package that's quite ready. But we are within a cycle of breeding to get that. How long does a cycle take? Well, about 10 years. But I would say it's coming. Key to that is higher protein concentration, stronger gluten, and improved water absorption. We now have some lines, not many, but we're getting into water absorptions around 66, 67, which is a huge improvement over the 57, 58, 59 that we see in regular red winters. So we're getting there. There's a couple other things that we're working on, and as a plant breeder, part of the role I see is creating new opportunities for farmers. And so we are working on hard white winter to some extent, and I'll talk about a variety in a minute. And we're also looking at some soft white winter wheat as well. Both of those are small efforts, but without an effort at all, we'd never see them. So I thought, well, before I go on with that, I'll maybe talk a little bit about this site in front of you. This is an irrigated site, obviously, and I kind of felt bad this morning. I thought maybe I should take you to dry land, but this is what I would call one of my main breeding sites, and essentially all the precious material is here. In other words, in most cases, there's one copy in existence of all the material here, okay? If the big white combine goes through, we have ways of recovering, but it wouldn't be pleasant. So we've got in front of you right here these signed plots. There's a block here, that's our seed increase. We actually seed those at a lower plant density and we rogue them. They form the basis for our replicated trials that go out this fall, okay? We put them on irrigation to make sure we get a good seed increase rather than having to put many more plots out on dry land. The rest of the plots out here, for the most part, and there's 2,400 plots here, are preliminary trials. Those are lines that for the very first time we're testing from an agronomic standpoint. So we're looking at yield. We're looking much more at maturity and so on. These lines have been tested for various diseases and so on. A little bit of quality work as well, but you know, we're testing a lot of lines for their yield. So on the preliminary side, there's about 15 or 1,600 lines that we're looking at for yield for the first time. Come September, when I'm putting trials together to advance, that 1,500 will go down to between 120 to 150 lines. So I'm getting rid of 90%. And from there, those lines the following year will get down to somewhere between 30 and 50 lines. And from there, 4, 5, 6 lines may go into registration trials. So you can see how that triangle that I was talking about works. We're going from very large populations to fewer and fewer elite lines that have all the characteristics, hopefully, that you would want to see. So what we do at this site, one of the reasons I like to put the preliminaries here is that we use high fertility, lots of water, to see what the yield potential is. It's a lot easier to see a 10% yield advantage at 100 bushels per acre than it is, say, at 20. Okay? The differences are bigger, so it's a lot easier. That's the first thing. The second thing is, with this type of yield, we definitely see more lodging. If I see lodging in these plots, the line is gone. And that's one way of ensuring that we've got good straw strength. The other thing that's great about it is because we've got a more humid environment, we also see more diseases. And contrary to what farmers would want, as a breeder, I want to see disease. If a line is susceptible, I want to know so I can throw it out. Okay, so, and we have various nurseries that we put out across Western Canada, specifically for leaf and stem rust resistance, for stripe rust, for bunt, for fusarium. But we also look at other things in these plots, things like tan spot, physiological leaf spot, even powdery mildew. Something that's particularly bad will be thrown away. Okay, so from preliminary trials that are grown on irrigation, that's the last time they're grown on irrigation because, of course, most of the winter wheat is grown on dry land. And so from there, we grow at 2 locations here in Lethbridge, at Warner, and I saw Brian and Andrew Otto in the group somewhere down at the back. We've got a long-standing site at their farm, and thank you very much. It's a very valuable site for us. We also test at Indian Head and at Brandon. And then from there, we add sites like Lacombe, Carmen, and Swift Current. So we broaden it out as time goes on. Okay, let's take a look at some of the varieties. Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about some varieties that for those of you who grow winter wheat or are considering growing winter wheat that you might want to be aware of. Of course, Radiant has been the most popular variety in Alberta since 2006. So it's starting to get a little bit long in the tooth, but when it came out, really set a new standard for straw strength. It's got great winter hardiness, and it's got wheat curl mite resistance, the first variety with that. And it had very good stripe rust resistance. Unfortunately, we've seen a continuing evolution of the various stripe rust races, and unfortunately, Radiant no longer has good resistance. It's got a gene called YR10. In some areas it's still effective, but certainly we have not seen that it's effective here. A new variety that is available this fall is AAC Elevate. And Elevate is actually, from a genetic standpoint, half Radiant. And it's got some other things thrown in. Very definitely higher yielding. It's earlier maturing than Radiant. Let me see. A little bit shorter, similar straw strength. From a disease standpoint, it's got stem rust resistance, intermediate leaf rust. When we got support for registration on this line, it was moderately resistant to stripe rust. It's now susceptible. So again, that continuing evolution of stripe rust races. So if you grow this line, be aware you may have to use fungicides. In addition, it's got moderate resistance to bunt, and it's got intermediate resistance to fusarium head blight. So it is a real advance on the disease side. It also carries the wheat curl mite resistance that Radiant has. What we're also seeing, and this goes back to some of the trials we have out at Warner, is that it looks like this line has the drought tolerance similar to Bellatrix. It tends to do particularly well under dry land, but will also do well in wetter conditions. This line here, which will be available next year, is called Wildfire, and this line is actually half Bellatrix. And I would say that, as you can see, in this plot at least, it's a little bit taller than Radiant. On average, that's not the case. Not quite as strong strawed as Radiant, but very definitely higher yielding, on average about 15% higher than Radiant. Couple days later maturing. As you go north, that maturity difference will be greater. It's got very good, well, it's moderately resistant to bunt and moderately resistant to fusarium head blight, and also has been resistant to moderately resistant to stripe rust. So I think if I was to predict which is going to be the next major winter wheat variety in Alberta, I would say we'll move from Radiant to Wildfire, based on its disease and based on its yield.
What about quality versus Radiant?
Okay, the question was, what about quality versus Radiant? It's very similar in quality, a little bit higher, about a quarter, about 0.3% higher in protein. So is that much? Not really, but it's very similar from that standpoint. I'll just, I should also mention, not that it's a threat right now, but Wildfire is the first variety with Russian wheat aphid resistance as well. The last variety I'll talk about is this one. This is W545, and I hope to go forward with this one in February. It's actually in its 4th year in the registration trials, and we did that because one year there was a lot of sprouting in samples and so on, and the decision was made to actually not do quality testing at all that year. So we're getting more agronomic data on this line, and we'll have a full set of quality data come this fall. I would say in a nutshell, this is the Emerson for Alberta. Essentially, with Emerson, Emerson of course is well known because of its resistant rating to Fusarium head blight. This one, in the past 2 years, has also received resistant ratings to Fusarium head blight. The difference is Emerson doesn't tend to do as well in Alberta as it does in Manitoba. The opposite is true for this line. This line is yielding about 10% more than Radiant over the past 3 years. It does really well in Alberta, not in Manitoba. It's got leaf stem and stripe rust resistance, it's got the Fusarium resistance, and it's also got a nice bump in protein. We're talking about 1% higher than Radiant. So I think this is one that I would say could have some real application here. It's a little bit taller. It's about the limit in terms of height that I would want to go. But for any of those of you who have had experience with moats and moats lodging on you, this one definitely has better straw strength than moats. It's not an Elevate, it's not a Radiant, but it's quite good. So I'll leave it at that. Any more questions? Andrew?
How far off for that one?
Well, at this point, we don't know because it has to be approved at the meetings in February. There are no flags on it. And so if it receives support, which is 2018, it would likely be available in 2022. So it's a little ways off. And that's the breeding game, you know, from the standpoint of when I make a cross to registration is about 10 years, and then there's another 3 or so to multiply. So if you think about it, the crosses that I made this year won't be in your hands until 2030. And it won't be me bringing them forward. Anything else?
Sorry. How do you screen for Fusarium head blight resistance? Just based on disease assay data, or you do dawn measurement as well?
It's a very good question. The question was, how do we screen for Fusarium head blight resistance? And that's where really good collaboration comes in. And we collaborate with the University of Manitoba. Of course, Anita Brule-Babel is the other winter wheat breeder in Western Canada. And she runs large Fusarium nurseries for both winter wheat and spring wheat. And I also collaborate with Gavin Humphreys at AAFC in Ottawa, and before him, Roddy Pandea. And they have large screening nurseries as well. So anything that we feel in the earlier generations that could have resistance based on the parentage, we screen through the Ottawa nursery, and as we get closer and closer to lines getting into the co-op, or the registration trial, I should say, and into the registration trial, we screen there. In the registration trial, we look at incidence, severity, as well as dawn. Brian?
I'm asking for a friend, Rob, near Camrose. He's never grown winter wheat before, and he has some unseeded acres.
Okay.
Considering winter wheat this year, and because it's a bare field, he'd love to get it in as early as possible.
Mm-hmm.
When is too early?
Oh gosh, when is too early? I would say, and Brian, maybe you can help me on this as well, I would say don't seed before August 20th. You seed anything before that, I think you could run into problems. And, you know, quite frankly, seeding onto bare ground, particularly in that area, that's a risky proposition to begin with.
Well, thank you. Your plots look beautiful. It's Bred Zeppelin. So the good news is, since we